All right, our final lecture from Chapter 4, and then we'll be moving on to Chapter 5 here in the second unit for the course, where we will be taking a look at the integumentary system, the skin. All right, so at the very beginning of Chapter 4, we said there are four major tissue types in the body, epithelial and connective, and so we just went through a whole bunch of different examples of various types of epithelial and connective tissues. And then your last two major types of tissue in the body are nervous and muscle or muscular tissues. All right, so nervous tissue, as we have already discussed, is present in the nervous system. So the brain, the spinal cord, and then your spinal and cranial nerves, and then the nerves that extend out and supply all parts of the body. And when we get to Chapter 11, later this semester, you're going to hear a whole lot more about nervous tissue in detail. Main cell type of nervous tissue, those are called neurons. And neurons are involved in the chemical, electrical signaling, where you send messages from the outlying parts of the body to the brain, and from the brain to all the various parts of the body. The nervous system is involved in fast-acting control. And so your nervous tissues, the main cell type in there, neurons, you have other cell types in there as well. And again, we're going to cover that in a lot more depth when we get to the last unit of the course. All right, how about muscle tissue or muscular tissues? Muscle tissues can be divided up into three types. Back up here, I just skipped forward several slides. You got three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And again, the very first lecture for Chapter 4, we mentioned that skeletal muscle tissues are the only types that can be voluntary. Cardiac and smooth are involuntary muscle tissues, which means you don't consciously control those. Like your heart, for example, you can't consciously tell your heart to beat or not beat. It doesn't. Those things continue without you thinking about them. Smooth muscle tissue, if you remember in the first lecture, we were looking at the wall of the small intestine and how you had smooth muscle tissue in there, which contracts to squeeze food and wastes that your digestive system is dealing with, squeezing those forward or sloshing them around back and forth. And that's not something you have conscious control over either. Skeletal muscle, though, you can have voluntary conscious control over your skeletal muscles, so they fall into that category. All right, skeletal muscle tissue consists of skeletal muscle cells and all right, so you know what, I'm not even going to mention that right now because it will we'll just hold off on that. I don't want to introduce more terminology and make this completely overwhelming. But your skeletal muscle cells, they're shaped like this. They're tube-shaped or cylinder-shaped type cells. And if you look at them under the microscope and you stain them with various dyes, they look striped. And those are called striations. Striations there refers to the striping that you see. And that striping is due to the proteins in these cells that allow contraction to take place, muscle contraction to take place. So you find these types of cells in your skeletal muscles that are attached to the bones or attached to the skin, like your facial muscles. These are the muscles that are involved in voluntary movement, maintaining posture, and your facial expressions. Little purple spots you see here on this microscopic image of skeletal muscle, those are the nuclei that you would find inside those types of cells. Also, your skeletal muscle cells can be multinucleate. If you remember that from Chapter 2, more than one nucleus in just one cell. These are big, gigantic cells. compared to many other types of cells in your body. Your cardiac muscle cells, you will find these in the heart, and they're involuntary. You can't control them. And they branch. They're kind of unusual because they'll have little branches on them that connect to other cardiac muscle cells. They typically just have one nucleus per cell, and they do have the little striations, the stripes in there, which are formed. Again, these cells are full of proteins that are involved in muscle contraction, as we'll learn about when we get to Unit 4. You find these, as you might guess, in the walls of the heart. All right, finally, your smooth muscle. Smooth muscle cells are also involuntary, and you find these in the walls of many hollow organs and vessels, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, which those are organs. Remember, technically, even though we're not used to thinking of those as organs, they really are. So you find these in the walls of things like the digestive tract, blood vessels, things that have to contract to help maintain pressure, like your blood vessels contract to maintain your blood pressure. The walls of your digestive organs contract to propel things forward. And you have them in the walls of other organs that have to squeeze things to push things around, propel things. The walls of the bladder, for example, you've got smooth muscle in there to squeeze urine out. The uterus, you've got smooth muscle cells in the walls of the uterus to contract when you need to squeeze a baby out during childbirth. So major organs, whenever you do any type of contraction or squeezing has to take place, you're going to have this type of muscle. Smooth muscle is the type of muscle cells you will have there. Smooth muscle consists of, if you actually looked at there's a picture there of the cell, a diagram, and if you looked at them under the microscope, you have these like little spindly type cells scattered around. And it's hard to see the borders between individual cells when you're really looking at them under the microscope. Darker spots are the nuclei in those types of cells, and you don't see the striping, those striations, like you do on the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle. But even so, though, these cells are still capable of contracting and relaxing together when the walls of an organ or a blood vessel have to contract to squeeze something forward or maintain pressure. All right. So we have finished Chapter 4. Be sure to do the required mastering and A&P homework assignments for all of the Chapter 4 lecture material. And you're ready to go ahead and move on to Chapter 5. We're going to cover the integumentary system. We're also going to have some additional topics, such as body fluids. We're going to talk about body fluids a little bit further, since that comes up throughout your A&P courses. We're going to talk a little bit more about metabolism. We've been talking about all these cells like fibroblasts, for example, that have to make all these fibers. Well, where do they get the energy? How do they harness the energy to power those types of things? We'll talk a little bit more about that. And we're also going to talk a little bit about protein production. How do you go from, remember we said the genes on DNA molecules, those are like recipes that tell your cells how to make various kinds of important proteins. We're going to talk a little bit about genetics and how all that works. I'm just going to hit some highlights on that. And then that will finish out Unit 2 for us. So see you in Chapter 5.